Good morning, everybody. Yins and yous, welcome. Is anyone from Pittsburgh actually from Pittsburgh here who can vouch for that? No? Okay, good. So, welcome. We're going to talk about biodiversity credits today. My name is Ryan Sarsfield from the Environmental Policy Innovation Center. I'm going to start out with a little 10-minute intro, kind of a 101, and then we'll introduce the panelists and have some free-flowing discussion. Just out of curiosity, because this is a fairly new topic for this conference and for most conferences, kind of see a show of hands for those of you who feel like you have a good sense of what biodiversity credits are in this new sense of the market. All right, a ripe crowd. This is fantastic.
Yeah, we're hoping you tell us.
Anyone in the panel? Okay, good. Great. So we'll get going here once I grab the clicker. So as I mentioned, I'm at EPIC. You've seen some of my colleagues, Becca Madsen, Mariah Blackbird, and Tim Mayle here in the audience in other panels. And we work on a variety of different environmental policy issues, trying to find better, more efficient ways to tweak policies so that the private sector can be better involved, so that government can get stuff done quicker on restoration, water policy, and a whole number of areas. And we're working these days on biodiversity crediting, which is a brand new market that we think has a tremendous potential, even though it's not quite as new as a lot of people pretend it to be. And we'll talk a little bit about that and what other markets it might be compared to. So let's get going. There we go. All right, biodiversity credits. So I'll read that out loud, but then we'll go through it. A certificate that represents a measured and evidence-based unit of positive biodiversity outcome that is durable and additional to what would have otherwise occurred. Now, this might sound familiar compared to, say, what a carbon credit is, or maybe compared to mitigation banking and species banking credits. Each of these words was highly wordsmithed with the Biodiversity Credit Alliance, and it's fundamentally measuring the uplift of biodiversity, the change in an intangible sense of what the earlier state was, and taking that biodiversity, taking it to a new level, maintaining it there. It's not necessarily selling off the asset. It often gets misinterpreted, but it's both something that can be done in a regulatory market, and we'll talk about that, and voluntary markets as well. And often the terminology gets confused a little bit depending on where you're coming from. Some people refer to habitat banking as one thing and credits as particularly voluntary, or the word credit is applied to just something voluntary and not regulatory. Here we're using it to mean the market as a whole, so kind of mixing and matching across those different areas because we think there's more similarities than differences and they can learn from each other. Also, out of curiosity, who recognizes those flowers? Yes, sir. One of our best fruits. All right. Where should I be clicking here? What should I point at? Yeah, but where should I point it? Towards you, okay. I think if I just...
That blacks it out. This is a blackout button. Don't want to hit that. Just...
okay.
Oh, wait a minute. It is. It's malfunctioning. Hold on. There we go. Back.
All right.
These guys right here, right? Forward, reverse.
Sorry, big thumbs here. Okay, so what might that look like? Well, this is not what people usually refer to as a biodiversity credit. This is a species bank from our friends at Westervelt, and this is something quite familiar to most of this audience and those who usually attend this conference. And we use this as an analogy when people talk about this market as if it were entirely new. We say, well, we've been doing this in the US for quite a long time. We don't call them biodiversity credits, but wetland banking and species banking share so many characteristics and similar goals and similar structures of what a good project is. We think it's an excellent analogy, not just carbon markets, and we'll get into some of those comparisons. And some of you would be familiar in the bottom right there, it mentions the investment from the Quebec Pension Fund. So we talk about this as one of the examples of biodiversity being investable. Again, familiar to this crowd and this conference, but when you go elsewhere, they think it's this brand new thing that biodiversity has never been invested in. that it's never been measured, it's never been credited. It's a really funny comparison. And when we have conversations with colleagues in Europe or elsewhere, they find it very interesting what our markets have done and the policies and structures that have developed and how well they've worked, because that's often brand new to audiences abroad. And then here's another example from England. Look familiar? Excellent work. So Emma will talk a bit more about this in the context of England's new regulatory biodiversity net gain policy. This is another site, and it works quite similarly to ours in the sense of being a habitat bank. But here is a type of biodiversity credit, though I think in England they would not call it credits per se, because credits would be voluntary there, but you get the idea. So this is not as new as people pretend it to be, but there's a new push to have a new kind of credit, in part related to corporate impact disclosure. We'll talk a little bit about that. So what's the potential? When people think about biodiversity and conservation, they're often stuck in a kind of traditional philanthropic model. We want to have philanthropy at this stage in certain contexts to get this market going, but ultimately we don't want to rely on philanthropy as this core and sole source of funding for biodiversity. We want to bring the private sector in, and ultimately, through one path or another, internalize the cost of biodiversity impact. And this gets real complicated with whether or not things are going to be offsets, and we'll talk a little bit about that as well. So efficiency, investability, making this an investable asset, as I mentioned, as if it weren't already. So in one version of this slide, I don't include that last bit in italics, but in this audience, it's very familiar, and people might say, well, you're already doing that. We've already been doing that a long time, right? And in the long term, these markets may and probably should exceed the size and scope of carbon markets, because land competition for biodiversity and food and timber and pulp and everything will endure long after carbon markets have solved the problem, so to speak. So someone said recently, carbon markets should wind down eventually. I agree with that, but we hope that they're successful in the meantime. Okay. So who will buy credits and why? All right, private sector demand. Companies will buy credits, we think, and they're already looking at this from a variety of perspectives for familiar reasons. Regulation, biodiversity, net gain, this is quite similar to banking in the US. They may want to, philanthropically, where the investment in the credit is not at all tied to any impact, and that's a good thing. We don't think that will generate as much of the necessary impact and investment in the long term, but that's certainly a good thing to have more money flowing in there. Shareholder pressure and public pressure, it's going to look good to people buying products, and it will help in market differentiation. Some of that will look quite similar to traditional corporate philanthropic efforts where they put money into a project, and even sometimes where they do things like insetting or they do a public-private partnership. But we don't want it to be solely mimicking the model where it's a one-off in marginal terms and not part of what companies typically would do as part of their general operations. We want to have that cost be built in so they invest in biodiversity as a normal part of doing business. And then finally, impact disclosure. We're going to talk more about that. We think will lead to impact compensation, whether we call it offsets or compensation or whatever. Offsets has been kind of a four-letter word in many circles. It's been really complicated in the carbon market as of late and for a long time now. And equally so in the biodiversity crediting discussions. A lot of folks in Europe are against it, a lot of folks in the US too, but other folks think it's actually pretty useful. There's a lot of discussion about whether it could or should not be used in indigenous lands, for example, where when we speak globally. So people are debating this right now, and this is one of the tasks we have to sort out as we go through. So I brought up this one slide just to give an example. This is one of the, I guess we could say, state-of-the-art in impact disclosure, the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures. And it's on the heels of the previous Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. And I just pulled this one image because it kind of captures the process from beginning to end. And you'll see from beginning to defining the purpose all the way through to number 6, to transparently disclose. And they treat it, and fair enough, at this stage, they treat it like that's the end stage. What's going to come next? right? So once companies have adequately done the accounting of their impact, what follows that? And I think this is going to follow the path of climate change related impacts, and they're going to have to find ways to compensate that one way or the other. And whether they call it offsets or something else, this is the discussion that we have to figure out over the next few years. So how do we do projects? What's a good project going to look like? So a lot of what we're going to talk about is comparisons to the carbon markets and comparisons to banking. So great crowd for that. And you'll see most of these issues listed here will sound very familiar to folks working on either one of those markets. And we're pretty unabashedly eager to mimic the protocols and practices and the risk reduction activities that the mitigation and species banking world have developed, because it's been fairly good and avoided many of the problems that we see in the carbon markets. So there's good carbon projects, there's bad carbon projects, and we know what can differentiate good from bad. So we want to take the good and leave the bad behind. So a lot of this is about general things that we're familiar with. Have good monitoring, third-party verification. We want to have good liability allocation, have a good sense of the long-term permanence of the project, and on and on and on and on. So most of these things will sound quite familiar to those who've done projects in the US in a similar way, but we want to make sure that new projects coming up are not kind of fly-by-night or weak methodologies that don't really either mandate good biological uplift or good measurement, and in many cases don't have much attention at all paid to where risk is allocated, whether that's in the buyer or the developer. But we want to make these things actually attractive to buyers and not have them left holding the ball or being sued by folks who might see what they've done as being poorly described offsets or greenwashing or whatever. We want to have good projects, real uplift. And there's a lot of debate about whether restoration or preservation should be the path to follow. In some cases, there's an impulse to follow the path of preservation like a traditional conservation project. There's a lot of good that can be done there. We're tending these days to stress restoration, in part because the additionality is much more salient. You can see what was done in a project. I was visiting a field site in Louisiana last week, looking at how a biodiversity project might work in southern pine with a Swedish investor we're working with named Carlbo. And we came up with this sense of describing it as, for the sense of crediting, it matters what management activities you do rather than the management activities you don't do. So we want to make sure those things are actually visible to potential buyers, to auditors, and to when we actually go and monitor in the field, we will see the distinction between the business as usual and the uplift that we're aiming for. All right, the path forward. So we're going to probably follow the path of climate impacts and carbon markets. So if you go back 15 years and you told somebody the SEC would release disclosure guidance on carbon, it might have seemed a bit far-fetched, right? But here we are. So what will it take for biodiversity to become, likewise, something as salient as a risk for investors? We're heading down that path. It's early, but just the uptake of the TNFD, for example, it's been super fast for the nature-related aspects of that. And we think that this path will be followed more or less, and it's especially moving fast in Europe. So as our European on the panel, Emma will represent the continent. Thank you very much. Then we want to learn from existing markets and structures. As I mentioned, carbon, banking, avoid those same mistakes. We want voluntary markets. We want to learn how to do projects. We don't have a regulatory market of this type in the US just yet. So in the meantime, companies and developers and everyone involved need to learn how to do this. And the way to do that is through voluntary credit projects. It's a bit complicated at this stage from the perspectives of buyers and sellers to figure out how do we jump into this just yet when we don't even know who will buy it. We don't have a lot of confidence in that. But pilot projects are getting going. I think there's a lot of interest in them. And we'll see how those pilot projects can actually teach us how to do them and also show what actual intangible terms, what those projects can look like. And then finally, we do want more regulatory markets. It's a bad word in some circles, but we think ultimately if we want to price in the cost of biodiversity impacts, when the WWF Living Planet report says that the average vertebrate on Earth has declined about 69% in population, there's a lot of work to be done. So I think there's a lot of investment to be done here, and regulatory markets will inevitably pop up in many parts of the world, as they have been, and we'll see what happens in the US. Maybe not in this administration just yet, but we'll see where things go. Maybe the next one, who knows? So we want to integrate credits with reporting frameworks. So things like TNFD, they encourage the description or the accounting to some degree of what the impacts will actually look like. But we want to connect what the measurement of the impact is to the measurement of the uplift. Whether it'll become a full-fledged accounting system is a bit harder to say, but it's not something that hasn't been done before in some sense. Again, I'll just keep saying this over and over again, as bankers know, the sense of what amount of damage was done to a particular ecosystem and what amount of credits were needed. These are things that are just discussed and don't always, there's not a single consensus, but it's not an impossible problem. And then finally, minimum standards. We want to set a high bar for that and high integrity protocols. Okay, on to our panelists. I'm going to read our quick bios here. I think everybody here is doing at least one other panel this session, or this conference, so they'll look familiar. We got small stars. Emma Tuvey is the Chief Ecology Officer of UK-based Environment Bank. They're aiming to restore nature at scale across England through a network of habitat banks. Their strategy will maximize environmental benefits, specifically ecosystem services, and support the wider aim of restoring biodiversity nationwide in a way that is robust and able to adapt to our changing climate. Adam Rigsby is on the board of ERBA. Many of you know him. He's an entrepreneur who owns and operates Riverbank Conservation LLC, an ecosystem restoration firm based in Austin. To date, Riverbank's projects have restored and permanently protected thousands of acres of aquatic and endangered species habitats across Texas, Colorado, New Mexico, and West Virginia. And Jen Bennett directs strategic outreach at Forest Trends, building out partnerships and thought leadership to mobilize conservation finance and the bioeconomy. She has spoken and written widely on nature-based economic models and environmental finance for a range of publications, including at the World Bank, World Economic Forum, Environmental Finance Magazine, Civil Engineering, Nature, and Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. All right, let's start. Emma, one of these standout markets, one of these new hot things is biodiversity net gain in England. What can you tell us about it? Where did it come from? How long did it take to get here? What's it all about?
Great. Well, thanks so much for being invited. It's brilliant to be here. So I'm Emma Tuvey. I'm Chief Ecology Officer at Environment Bank. And Environment Bank are basically a private equity-backed commercial operator in a brand new, emerging, very nascent regulatory market in the UK. Biodiversity net gain is a new mandatory requirement. It's in response to a new act that was given royal assent in 2021. The act was given royal assent, but we've had a 2.5-year transitionary period where all the market players, developers, landowners, local authorities, government, we've been preparing ourselves and ready. And as of February this year, 12th of February, we are now in a live market. And what that means is that every single development project, construction, brand new construction schemes across the whole country, with the exception of a very few things, so maybe single dwellings or extensions to homes, everything else has to comply with this new law. And that requires every scheme in the round to deliver a net gain, at least 10% biodiversity net gain in biodiversity value as a result of that scheme in the round. It's transformational, genuinely transformational. We've had a fairly broken planning system, consenting system in the UK that's led to significant decline. We are one of the most depleted countries in terms of biodiversity in the world. We've seen a 70% decline in biodiversity in the last 50 years. 70% of our land use in the UK is agricultural and 8% is urban. Like, we are really on the edge of a failing ecosystem. And this new law is transformational. It's really about driving nature recovery. So what developers can do is they have to follow a mitigation hierarchy. They have to seek to do everything they possibly can to avoid and design out harm as part of their scheme in the first place. Then they can seek to enhance and create habitats within their red line, but so often and very frequently that's not possible to do in a legitimate and effective way. So then they can seek off-site, offsetting, essentially, solutions. That means they can either do it themselves in a bespoke way, work with the landowner themselves, or they can purchase what we call biodiversity units, which is the credits. It's all different terminology globally. But they can purchase them from a banker like us to meet their statutory requirements. So that's what we're doing. We're building this portfolio of land across the country to give full coverage for developers so that they have a solution, a ready-made, off-the-shelf solution to meet their statutory requirements. We're therefore able to pool these resources from the development sector and really deliver landscape-scale, highly impactful nature recovery projects instead of this piecemeal bits and bobs of restoration across the country. So that's what we're up to.
Great. I think I was so eager to hear about that, I skipped right over part of our planning here, which was...
You did. You threw me a bit, but I'm okay.
You did great. So part of what we want to do is have each of them do a couple minutes of introduction of themselves and their work. So maybe that's a segue into who are you and what are you working on?
I've sort
My apologies.
of covered it, but...
You covered it fairly well. What do you do there at Environment Bank?
So I guess my role, so I am an ecologist. I'm a trained ecologist. I come from a background of consultancy, actually working for really big, dirty development schemes like nuclear power stations and new airports, and trying to work with developers to mitigate their impact on the environment with our slightly broken planning system and no teeth to it at all. And it, frankly, was really tough, hard work and a bit depressing, because you'd work on these schemes, you work so hard, and then at the end of it, there was the positive gains from these projects was negligible and, in fact, always negative. So that was my background at EB. So I moved to EB, and now I'm really responsible two hats. One, the ecological soundness of everything that we do. High integrity principles that you've kind of talked through already are so key to us as a business, not just from a it's the right thing to do perspective, but because it brings stability to our new market. And then I'm also operationally responsible for delivering this network of sites, so bringing on land and delivering these incredible, amazing restoration projects.
Great. Adam, tell us about what your work is in Riverbank.
Okay, great. So Adam Rigsby, Riverbank Conservation. I guess I'm the founder, I'm the CEO. I feel like I'm the janitor sometimes, the accountant, whatever I have to do to make it work. But we're a small organization, got 5 of us full-time, and we're spread out a pretty good bit. In the biodiversity space, I'm really limited to one species, and that's a species with a funny name, the lesser prairie chicken. It's kind of unfortunate that we're supposed to take, a regulatory protected species this seriously with such a funny name. But anyway, it's a great, as a restoration practitioner, I guess I'm sort of an ecologist of sorts. I have not had an opportunity to work at this scale before, so that's what's most exciting to me about the lesser prairie chicken. And I'm a water guy, studied rivers, studied dam removal academically, and now I'm restoring prairie. And not like, 100 acres here, 200 there. It's more like 10,000 acres here, 20,000 acres there. So the scale is really exciting. And it's one of the most endangered ecosystems in the world. I mean, the number that's floated around is there's less than 1% left of America's North American prairies. So it's really exciting. And then I get to work with, these are working lands, so these are ranchers and farmers. They, honest to God, work. I feel like, what I do is I pass around a paper credit, and I make money off of it. And these people are constantly working the land, and they have a great relationship with it, and I'm just glad that I can provide them an alternative land use that they see value in, and we can get some deals done. So yeah, that's my biodiversity experience.
Great. Jen?
I actually was not prepared to talk about myself. I thought we were going to just go straight into the good
We
stuff.
can do that too.
Okay.
You want the hardest question to start?
Yeah.
I'll give you an easy
Hit
one.
me.
All right. So yeah, you've seen Jen now on 2 panels at least, so you're familiar
No.
with her. Yeah. Okay, great.
Sure.
So a lot of what we're hearing on biodiversity from the current markets as they are is from the carbon market. They want co-benefits. They want to sometimes try to stack and bundle things. So what do you think? Where will those things interact? Both the potential for co-benefits, will those look like biodiversity credits? Do you want to speculate on that? And what is the carbon market trying to do, and why is biodiversity important to them now? It's only 4 questions
Yeah,
at
I was
once.
going to say that's not one question.
Just improvise. Free will.
I guess
free
I
will
asked for it.
about
Okay. So, I mean, there is definitely a substantial share of folks out there buying carbon credits right now who are very motivated by biodiversity benefits, and also, I should say, social co-benefits, so sustainable development stuff. And we are seeing that they're willing to pay more. There's a significant premium in the market for those credits. And what's interesting is, we talk to some of the buyers and the project developers, and they say, well, we actually, the carbon is kind of the co-benefit for us. And so I do think that there's sort of this interesting direction of travel where if you play it out, would that group of buyers be interested in jumping into a biodiversity credit space, or could we see, stacking, bundling? And I would point you all to Ryan's article that he published recently on stacking and bundling if you don't know what those terms mean. But I can't really speculate, I think, at this point on sort of what the right structure will end up being. I think sometimes environmental markets, people have a little bit of a Field of Dreams mentality, where it's like, let's build this whole system, and then the buyers will come. And
like my entire introduction.
Whereas, I think what the carbon markets have done well on the voluntary side is innovate and respond to what the buyers are asking for, and sort of meet the needs as they pop up. Where am I going with this? So in any event, I think the question that I would ask is what's going to drive the Veda, bring the most value to nature, right? How do we maintain that premium or maximize it, and whatever structure that looks like, and it may be a few.
Great.
That's what I know. Yeah.
Yeah, I ask in part because a lot of the places and contexts and companies I hear about biodiversity crediting in one sense or another from are currently operating carbon companies, because they see this as a way to, as Jen said, have higher prices, but also they see it to differentiate and have another kind of product that's not just on carbon. So we've encouraged them to go for it, but not necessarily tie all the biodiversity credits themselves to carbon. And when they want to do co-benefits, that can be good too. If you're measuring biodiversity and showing that, that's always good. But we would rather not have all the biodiversity's new market like this tied to the carbon market for lots of different reasons, right? Okay, Adam, I talked about regulatory and voluntary. These are potentially two markets that are popping up currently. This also happened with the carbon market, but any thoughts on the standards of regulatory versus regulatory, and how might we learn from this in the experiences we've had in the U.S. as we go towards these new markets?
Yeah, I mean, I think there probably should be some differences, in general. I think in terms of regulatory markets, I mean, that implies compliance, right? So there's some legal standard there. And I think you have to have a demonstrably compliant credit or offset or whatever the case may be. You need to match the impact to the offset, and you need to have some confidence that it's commensurate in value. Voluntary markets, of course, that's consumer choice. This is not a compliance move. You get to choose whether you buy this credit versus that credit, and you can pick through whatever the various attributes are from your choices and select based on what makes you the most comfortable. So that would imply there's some flexibility in the product, and I think you need to embrace that, and then see what the consumers choose. However, as voluntary markets mature and you're getting more and more trading, like the carbon market, I think that at some point there is some fiduciary responsibility in terms of maintaining the quality of your credit so that people know that they're actually buying what they think they're buying. So at some point, I think these voluntary markets, if they're active enough and as they mature, they do have a responsibility to increase their standards over time. But I would discourage, excuse me, I would discourage anyone setting up these voluntary markets to try to jump right out of the gate with the highest of standards and the perfect, market boundaries, because it's just too complicated. You're not going to get it right from the get-go. So learn as you go, slowly stack in these standards over time as you realize what can be absorbed by the consumers. And it should take care of itself. And then, it's all about monitoring, verification, and transparency. And if you don't get it right and the market matures, Wall Street Journal will dig into it. And so, or The Guardian, as the case may be. And then, that's just shame. And shame, as I think Jen's presentation yesterday showed us, affected the market immediately, at least in terms of carbon. So, yes, I think in general, there's a difference that should be respected between the two.
Any reactions?
Yeah,
I was
can
going to
I
ask
jump
you,
on
yeah,
that? Yeah.
voluntary and regulatory. Any thoughts?
Well, I actually, I think what Adam said about how do we think about sort of almost like introducing complexity or ratcheting up in quality over time. I wouldn't say that to a reporter, but I think that that's really smart because I worry a little bit about how complicated this all looks if you are like a company complying with the TNFD for the first time. I mean, I was at an event this spring that was a lot of investors and companies and service providers who sort of grappling with the financial disclosure piece. And it is so damn confusing and complicated, talking about how you understand. I mean, it's hard for carbon, and then when you're talking about nature, your impacts on nature, and understanding them and managing them, that's a real migraine, I think. And I think we saw, the VCM, the voluntary carbon market is one analogy for this, but another one is the zero deforestation commitments that all happened in New York in 2015, where hundreds of corporations were like, we are going to eliminate deforestation from all of our supply chains by 2020, and then not a single one did it because it's hard. And also, I think a lot of it was there wasn't really a point of entry. There wasn't an off-the-shelf solution, as you said. You couldn't buy a credit. So what a lot of people did was they bought FSC certified products. It was like, okay, we can understand our entire supply chain, or we can just buy things with FSC labeling. Which one do you think they did, right? So thinking about how you provide an easy entry point, off-the-shelf products, I understand it's going to be really complicated behind the curtain, but how do we make this as simple as possible for the buyer, at least initially as they're learning how to do this stuff? I think that would be wise.
Great. Emma, going back to, if you have a comment on that, go for it.
Well, I did, just really quickly, is that we say this a lot at EB, perfection is the enemy of the good. And I think I'm an ecologist, and if you leave it to the ecologists, they'll talk about this for 100 years. And they'll never agree either. But I do think there are some really core principles, those high integrity principles, that we know them now. We've learned from the VCM, and we can adopt them now and we don't need perfect standards and we don't need to agree on everything, but because that causes an inertia in the market for actors. But I do think the core principles that you talked about, Adam, around governance, around funding security, and really, really important transparency around data and MRV, those ones are really key.
So, Emma, all of these things had a long lead up and have launched into the world as of February. So how is the market reacting? How is B&G going? How are buyers reacting? It's a brave new world.
It really is a brave new world. So we're blessed. So as I say, we're private equity backed, and we've had funding for 2.5 years to mobilise into this space. So we've got a whole range of actors. So of course, landowners are absolutely key stakeholders in this new market, and they're scared. They're excited but scared. So in Europe, obviously, there's been a lot of political change, particularly in the UK. There's a change in the subsidy landscape. There's change in climate, which is adding huge risk for agricultural landowners in terms of predicting long-term income streams, and they're looking for diversification of income. So it's a brilliant, exciting opportunity to explore this as a new diversification of income. But at the same time, this is quite a complex market. The regulatory regime requires a lot. There's a lot of risk and liability to be an actor in that space. And so, and because it's brand new, there's not a lot of clear information available to landowners on how to access this market and how to manage risk. So, I mean, at EB, we've built a model where we take all the risk. We work directly and co-create projects with landowners. We actually pay for actions, not outcomes. Controversial, but that's because we take the risks around outcomes. So we reward our landowners in an uncertain landscape, and if there are failures, then we have contingency and we intervene to manage that. So it's a brilliant new opportunity for landowners, but there's a lot of risk around that they're nervous about. Developers, again, getting their heads around it. The big strategic housing developers, the big infrastructure developers, they're all over it. They have in-house teams, they have their own ecologists. They've been working out what are the economics of this for them, how do they want to deliver their B&G, the on-site, off-site balance, all of that. They've generally got their heads around, but the smaller scale developers, where they've got less flex, they don't have the skills and the knowledge, certainly don't have an ecologist in their team, they're in panic mode at the moment. And an off-site solution like ours that's off the shelf, they can buy units and walk away risk-free, skip away into the sunset, and we take on all of that liability. It's a really neat solution, and it also unblocks the planning system for them. It gives confidence in that kind of consenting regime. So the developers it's a mixed bag, but again, lots of learning going on. I think the key area of concern or potential barrier to the market thriving quickly is around local government. So I think here you call them easements, but we call them...
We're trading each other.
Yeah,
I learned bits and bobs earlier today.
We call them conservation covenants, but essentially it's a legal agreement, very similar to here, where you bind the land for at least 30 years. So that's embedded in our law. All of our biodiversity net gain projects have to be bound and secured for at least 30 years. And we need a responsible body or a local government body to be signatories to that agreement. And they're not ready. So we're a month or so into this new world. Local government is underprepared. They're under-resourced. They don't have the skill sets or the capacity to engage. And they're also scared of doing something wrong. So I know that we were sort of talking yesterday about how you've been through this and you see these are wrinkles in our brand new market, and I know they will change, but there are these little hurdles that each week we're just trying to navigate through and actually handhold all of the players so that we can have a smooth running market.
Great. So, Adam, this all sounds great, what's going on in England, and clearly the corporate demand is coming any minute. You must have half a dozen projects for lesser prairie chicken biodiversity credits in the works, right? What are you waiting for?
Well, we do have quite a few lesser prairie chicken credits. If anyone's in the market, let me know. But that is a regulatory market. And when it was a voluntary market, we closed exactly 3 sales in 10 years. So regulation is one hell of a driver. That doesn't mean that there can't be successful voluntary markets. But the problem with our portfolio of lesser prairie chicken credits was it was a regulatory credit. It went through Fish and Wildlife Service. We accepted and even encouraged the highest of standards. And higher standards, as everybody knows, there's a lot of old pros in this room shaking their heads. High standards mean high prices. And when it's voluntary and it's coming out of your bottom line, you don't really want to buy many of them. So I'll give you a sense of scale. We closed our first voluntary deal in West Texas. That was a renewable energy. It was wind farm. They did the work through Fish and Wildlife's calculations on what their impacts would be, and no way. I mean, there's just no way. We can't afford it. The bottom line isn't even that fat. So they came back to us and said, you know what would make us feel good? Maybe like 1/10 of this. And that's okay, I'll take it. If it makes you feel good, we'll do it. So we did, and that was actually a significant deal in the sense that it was 7 figures. We're closing 8-figure deals now, more than an order of magnitude difference, because they have to buy it if they're going to build. And if they can expect it, they can bake it into their pro forma, which kind of gets me back to this concept of slowly easing into these standards. In Emma's case, I had no idea just about everybody who does anything to their land is now responsible for paying into this or purchasing units. I mean, that's a huge adjustment. And I don't know what your pricing is, but I suspect it's a shock to them that they now have to spend that money. So that can just shut economic activity down or slow it down. And, the economic repercussions of that are real. So I would just say easing into these regulatory situations so that projects that have long planning lives, like 10 years, they're not just shocked at the end of the day when they think they got into the finish line and now they have to scrap their entire project or completely reconfigure it. Real consequences for real big projects. So easing into it is way better.
So back to offsets, Jen. Offsets. It's all we hear about in the carbon market now, and it seems like for a while, right? And then it's likewise happening, a similar debate in biodiversity. Do you think companies are up for an offset context once they've been through this rigmarole with all of what's going on with carbon?
Well, it's interesting. In the carbon markets, people are not saying offsets anymore. It's credit now. You've all been informed. We don't because it's a bad word, right? It sounds like it's a get out of jail free card or something like that. And I've noticed sort of in these conversations around voluntary biodiversity crediting, everyone is going, well, we're not talking about offsets. This is not compensation. It's nature positive. And I have some questions about the logic where it's like, okay, so your credit activity is going to be completely divorced from your impact, and like, is that really where we want to be going? But that's for another day. So, in any event, it makes me wonder if some of this urge to distance the new space of voluntary biodiversity crediting from offsetting there's a little bit of like being thrown out with the bathwater in terms of all of the lessons and experience that like the folks in this room have, all of the runway that's been built in compensatory mitigation markets and through voluntary initiatives like the Business and Biodiversity Offset Standard. Like, let's not forget all of that. I also, and this is me just playing devil's advocate, I mean, I think it's sort of interesting, like this, the idea of a credit itself, it's sort of based on this logic of compensation, right? Like sort of at the heart of a credit is, it is a unit compensating for another unit. And, you know, as we seem to be sort of taking the voluntary carbon markets as the model, and sort of, so we take the credit as the model, like what stowaways are on that ship, because
They're invasives, by the way.
yeah, they're rats, and they're gonna kill all the because you know, if what you're really trying to do is deliver nature positive action in the context of the voluntary space, you know, a credit, you know, you bring in these concepts like additionality. Does, you know, that's a tricky one for biodiversity, as you sort of alluded to, and I wonder, you know, what about, like in lieu fee funds, we have other mechanisms for channeling finance to biodiversity, and at least from, you know, to reiterate my former point, from the buy side, like it looks a lot simpler, right? Like you pay a fee, there's cost certainty, it's to the Nature Conservancy instead of like one of these terrifying people from the private sector who are obviously up to no good. You know, I think staying a little bit open as we move forward, and sort of and being really clear about like what we inherit when we take the VCM as the model. And you know, if we're saying, okay, great, we're gonna bring in additionality, being clear about what that means. I'm clearly just thinking out loud at this point, so I'm gonna stop talking. But
Let's shift
those
into
are some
actually
thoughts, yeah.
how we should do projects. I'm curious, from the English perspective, how does that methodology work? What are you measuring? There's all the different ways of measuring and different protocols for how we do crediting in the U.S. But what's DEFRA? What is DEFRA, first of all,
So-
and what is their methodology?
Yeah, okay. So, and I'm going to bring in the point about offsets, because the answer to that question also really reinforces the need and the legitimacy of offsets in the right context, right? So, and let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater. So DEFRA is our Department for Environment, Farming and Rural Affairs. Okay, so it's our environmental governmental department. And they, alongside Natural England, who are also our government body for nature, have designed a beautiful metric. It's called the Biodiversity Metric. And there's one metric. It's a spreadsheet. It's not really that jazzy. But what it brings is a really clear, usable, quantifiable way to value nature. Now, I know ecologists get nervous about this because it's simplifying the complexity of nature, but actually without it, it's just professional judgment. And that creates a mess, and also underpins why a lot of the planning system and the degradation of nature in England particularly has gone the way it has. So how it works, in really simple nutshell, is that you measure and value nature on the development site in exactly the same way as you will on the offset site. That's a really key point, right? And what you do is it has to be done by a competent ecologist. So it's a brilliant, it's the time for ecologists, by the way. Nature, an ecologist, if you have children and they don't know what to do for their job, ecology is great. Surveying habitats, not only the categorization of what types of habitats you have, but also their quality, the condition of them, how good they are. Now that categorization also defines how important they are, like how distinctive, how rare, how valued they are in their local context in England. It uses that and an area-based information to calculate essentially the number of biodiversity units that a piece of land has. Now, biodiversity units aren't all the same. They take into account different habitat types and value and distinctiveness and rareness. You calculate the value of your development site. You pre-development, you calculate it post-development, and if there's a residual loss, then you can use an off-site site. You use the same calculator to bring you up to your at least 10% gain in nature value. That's it in a nutshell, right? And it is relatively simple, but the key is that everyone's using the same thing. All the developers, all the ecologists, all the landowners, all the local government, everyone's using the same thing, and it's consistent.
Adam, how does that sound in the way that they're trying to measure all the biodiversity to some degree compared to how things are measured in a lesser prairie chicken project?
Oh, okay.
Because you mentioned it's a prairie restoration wholesale in addition to the focal species. So how does it compare to what I'm missing?
It sounds more like our stream and wetland markets, honestly, where and congratulations, by the way, you open the shop up with a real metric and not just leave it to the sponsors to throw out ideas, which is what we did here in the States until we realized you've got 10 different projects with 10 different metrics, and it was just a nightmare. Some of them were better than others. If you're a developer, you had to run 10 different protocols through your project to go price shopping. I mean, it was just crazy. So congratulations. That's not a small feat to just get out there with a single
I don't
metric.
think I can take credit, but thank you.
Well, I'm sure you had something to do with it. But Ryan, to answer your question, it's a little bit more complicated for chicken in the sense that, in general, an acre of habitat is an acre of offset or credit. So that's simple. But it's defining what quality of acre or what the plant composition really is what it comes down to, plant composition of that acre as to whether it's habitat or not. And its location and a few other things. So it's a little bit more on the ground stuff for defining habitat in space. For us, for our clients, it's very different. For our clients, it's basically if their project runs through known habitat, it's mapped as habitat, and it's not, already impacted in some way. Road, power line, even an agricultural field would qualify as a, an impact and no longer habitat. So if they go through native range, native prairie, then it's assumed to be habitat, and that's that. So it's not quite identical to that, but what you described is effectively what we do in our stream wetland markets.
So we have two different ways of measuring biodiversity. There's lots of ways to measure carbon. Has the variation in carbon measurement resulted in any problems for the carbon market, would you say? And how the carbon market has lost trust, perhaps in some quarters, because there's been opacity in measurement and other issues related to that. Any thoughts on that, Jen?
Well, I think, the loss of trust in the carbon market probably is a little bit more around, well, number one, the motives of the buyers, that sort of fear that, folks are going to just kind of continue with business as usual and buy a bunch of cheap offsets. I think there's fear of sketchy project developers taking advantage of communities. And then I think there is distrust of some of the methodologies, and most of that really has been centered around questions about avoided deforestation and degradation, because you're measuring against a counterfactual, right? What would have happened if this project were not here? And that's always going to be a little bit easy, I think, to question. And how do you set that baseline? And so there have been, but I think what's interesting is it's actually probably produced much better methodologies, and this sort of shift to dynamic baselines. And now actually we're seeing project developers really wanting the standards to keep tightening their MRV requirements, because right now, if you sort of under the current rules from all of the standards. If you are going above and beyond on MRV, you can't really recoup that in your pricing. And so what they would like to see is the floor come up for everybody in terms of those standards. Did that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I think the we look to the carbon market for where they have had more to the faults than the strengths, but there are strengths, and so it's been interesting. But we do come back to that avoided deforestation being potentially equivalent in its perception to preservation because of the additionality concerns.
Absolutely.
Right?
And I think there's also the distrust, like, it almost feels kind of existential, right? Like all of our fears that we're going to blow it on climate change have just sort of like all been put on the voluntary carbon market. And I wonder if it is part of like, it's sort of a ton of carbon is a hard thing to get your arms around, right? You know, what I hear and sense is there's like a real desire to actually kind of see this stuff, right? Like where's the carbon? Where's the project? And so I think biodiversity actually, you know, there's so many great stories that can be told from these projects. So you're already ahead. And I think tech allows us to really kind of bring the project close to us in ways that we couldn't do 10 or 15 years ago. I mean, I think there's just amazing stuff happening with camera trapping and eating, you know, like you can really kind of illustrate the uplift more, and even literally like, here's the project on the map, which sometimes is all you need to do. So that, I think, like leaning into that is helpful.
Yeah, I think it's going to be very interesting for buyers when they might be looking at great crested newt, for example. We were discussing this iconic UK species. Great crested newts or prairie chickens are indeed more tangible.
In France, they have the little bustards, which
The
is
little
my
bustards.
favorite. Yeah.
Yeah. Let's shift to questions from the audience. Any questions about little bustards?
Did she just make that up?
Big bustards?
No.
Any size bustard
I
we
had
can
to
discuss
assemble
here.
a database
Yeah.
of every habitat bank in the entire world, and so I spent a lot of time looking at all of them. And the little bustards.
Ben can confirm.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Hi, Dave Urban from Ecosystem Investment Partners. This has been a great talk. Emma, I'm very curious as to if you're already seeing political pushback. I know when there is change and that there are new requirements, there becomes political pushback. We in the U.S., of course, have been living through multiple years of political pushback to our wetland laws. And so I'm just curious, what's happening on the political side? Where do you see, are there going to be, you know, is there going to be a change with the change of government, or how's all that, how do you see that?
Yeah, so in England, we're made up of 320-ish local government authorities, and we're not even a very big country. So we don't work. It doesn't work quite like it does in the States in terms of your state level laws. So, but the local political nuances are extremely challenging. So whilst we're a national provider, we're developing a portfolio of sites across the whole country. Actually, what it is a collection of very localized markets that combine together to create this national market. And we have to operate very, very differently in each of those local markets because of the local politics, essentially, and the local policies and preferences of the local politicians, and we have to navigate that extremely carefully because essentially our local government bodies are also the gatekeepers to the market because they oversee it, they're the consenting gateway. They also want to be players and actors in the delivery market, and so we're sensitively, gently treading carefully around each of these. And some are we're their best friends, and they love us, and they're like, "Please come and help us. We need a solution, and we don't know how to do it." And then others are hostile. So the local government context is really interesting. Now, there is, as you say, there may be a change in national government expected in the coming months. Certainly within the next year, we will see how that pans out. personally, I think we've been through so much. Now, I know 2.5 years of mobilisation, but this law has taken about 15 years to get to this place. Our founder, David Hill, he's been lobbying really hard, and he's done it, and it's a really exciting time. I think that the shift it's not been overnight. It's taken so long to get to this place. I think the shift back to a regime without this law would be too much. I think it would be so disruptive. Yes, there's lots to iron out. Yes, there are challenges still to overcome. But broadly, there's buy-in from all the players. So I think B&G is here to stay.
Can I jump in on that? Not to answer the B&G bit, just bit. Yeah. Dave, I've been wanting to share this publicly for a little while. I think we have a supply problem in the United States with credits in general, because it makes it difficult for our clients to comply. And if they can't comply, they can't build their project. And if they can't build their project, they can't make their money and make payroll and all the things that go with it, right? So what they do is they then reach out to their representatives because they're mad. And they should be mad. So I think it's on everyone in this room that's involved in 404 market, Endangered Species Act markets, whatever the case, let's do better. Let's do better at getting more credits on the market to make it easier to comply. And then it's not just that, right? You have a better chance at price competition if you actually have supplies between competitors in the same service area. And that's a good thing in the sense that it becomes easier to comply and you're getting more restoration than you are getting impacts on the ground.
There in the back, in the green shirt. Is there a microphone? Yeah, go for it.
So I'm curious, in a voluntary market, how would you quantify biodiversity gains across different types of ecosystems and then standardize those into credits that can be traded? Or do you not do that? And are we seeing people maybe invest more in projects as opposed to buying what you would call credits? The symmetry of this stuff is something that I can't quite wrap my head around sometimes.
I can give that a shot, but chime in as well, right? So yeah, there's ongoing debates about, on one side, saying we need a universal unit. We need to have secondary trading. We need to have this on global exchanges such that these things are truly liquid and a commodity. And I think the example of a species banking in the US suggests that we can have it be investable with locally appropriate and ecologically appropriate methodologies that have units. I think in some contexts we might, let's say for example, there's a salmon credit. You can imagine a consensus for salmon credits in, say, the Pacific Northwest, and it could even extend to Canada, where everybody operating that system uses similar methodology, and that would make good sense. Outside investors could buy those credits if they needed to, but it need not be compatible with gazelle credits from Zambia, right? As for those that want to have a singular credit, there's strong arguments for that. There's some indices that talk about, do you remember it's a certain percentage increase in an index or a certain percentage boost over a standardized baseline. But whether that's necessary or not, I doubt it. I think it's probably better to have, systems that are appropriate to the legal and regulatory context in the countries where they are, that fit the social context of where they are, and critically the ecological context, because longleaf pine related credits may not have anything to do with like a Gila monster credit. And if we try to put them into the same box, they're going to have a problem. So that's where I stand, but there's people disagree with that. Yeah.
Hello, over here. I'm
Hi.
Ann McEnany from the Alumbra Innovations Foundation. I haven't heard very much conversation about managed aquifer recharge, groundwater infiltration. Is that considered part of a biodiversity credit, or is that a separate market opportunity?
I would say I have not heard anything either because it hasn't come up. Any other comments?
In Washington State and a few other places, you can do groundwater recharge credits. It's all regulated. And and sometimes there's some sort of like fungibility with surface water credits depending on the hydrology. But I don't think that's really been part of the biodiversity.
Probably a good market,
Yeah.
but a different market. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, there could be a way to do it, right? I know that they're doing some aquifer recharge in Arizona, strictly a water rights play. But in order to get the water to the recharge zones, it goes through, natural channels, rivers, streams, which of course means that you have these bright green riparian zones. And in some cases, there are endangered species associated with that space, and certainly biodiversity associated with space. It's limited, right? Because you don't want to move water through Arizona any longer on the surface than you have to. But perhaps there's a way. Or if the groundwater recharge zone was somewhere, where it would support another habitat as opposed to just, say, riverine. I mean, a prairie, I guess that could work too. Maybe. I just haven't heard of it, those two together. Mostly a water rights play in America.
So we have a mic over here with the gentleman that's standing, and there's also a mic over here, if we can keep that moving.
Yeah.
But
Wayne
go
White.
ahead, Wayne. Yeah.
Retired Fish and Wildlife Service was part of what put together conservation banks out in California. Plus, I had the marvelous opportunity to work in BBOP, the Business and Biodiversity Offset Program, where we bounced around the globe with pilot projects, volunteering to do pilot projects, to establish policies and procedures and give it to a country and see if they wanted to take it. I have always said that you have to have a regulatory regime to make this work. However, as I look at carbon, that's not necessarily the case. So I want to test the voluntary part, not with a question to you, but the audience. You all flew in from where? Those of you that flew in, raise your hand. Now, keep your hand up if you offset your carbon footprint. That's what I was afraid of. I still think it could happen because you got corporate responsibility out there. You may not have the standards, the high standards, but I'm hoping it does become real and we can get good voluntary programs out there. But next time I ask this question, I want more hands up in the air.
As an example, Australia passed their nature repair law, and when we spoke to folks in the government there, they were very happy that it had passed, but there had been pushback against the idea of offsets leading up to its passing, and that was nixed from the law, which kicked off, the large majority of the expected demand, full stop, right off the beginning. So that's a real-world example of when you have that offsets potential and you take it out, demand goes with it. So kind of expected, but that's the reality. We had a couple questions at the table up here. Hi.
Yeah. Hi. This is a question for Emma. Are you finding enough land to do these projects on now that you've accumulated money? It sounds to me a little bit like a big in lieu fee type program, but are you finding enough land and takers to do those enhancement projects, and what does that begin to look like?
Great question. So at EB, we do buy land, but in the main, actually, we take out a long-term tenancy on land for at least 33 years. And really, we secured our funding. Most of that funding is on land acquisition and rewarding stewards and landowners for delivering on the ground nature recovery. The process is really hard. Now, land structures in the UK, we have some brilliant land structures, but it's not built for nature conservation, long-term nature conservation. So, and culturally, there's barriers that we've had to navigate around landowners feeling extremely, farms have been in their ownership for generations, and they feel extremely proud to put food on the table for the country, and shifting that into a land use that's more nature focused. All of those conversations, the tax regime in England and how that adds complexity to changes in land use, the long-term nature of these projects and how that feeds into the sort of costs and payments to landowners over time. All of that's been a huge learning curve, and it's certainly led to that land acquisition and onboarding of land has taken longer than we have expected, but it is moving. And I think, you know, I sort of mentioned earlier that the landscape's quite uncertain for landowners in the UK. They don't have a great clarity on what's best, and the advisory kind of support available is quite limited, but it is moving in the right direction. And it's getting slightly easier, but it is much harder than we thought it would be.
Hi, go ahead. Just push the
There we
button.
go. There we go. I'm Leslie Allison. I'm with the Western Landowners Alliance, and I have a question that concerns the avoided conversion versus the additionality that you talked about at the beginning. So we have landowners all over the West on millions of acres, excited about doing a lot of different projects. They're restoring streams, wetlands, endangered species, rangelands, forests, and so forth. They're very interested, obviously, in these markets, but they're wondering, maybe, are they going to get credit for the work that they're doing now, or should they, and there's a lot of federal funding, a lot of other support out there to help with these projects, a lot of them doing it out of their own pockets. They're beginning to wonder if they should just push pause on all the restoration work that's currently going on in the hopes that this market will emerge, and in the fear that it will be an additionality sort of a thing. So wondering what you would advise landowners today.
Baseline. I was just saying, we have in the UK, from a BNG perspective, have very similar challenges. Our landowners are allowed to use any enhancements that they've done on the land since January 2020. So they can retrospectively create credits from those activities, but only if they can demonstrate the baseline that was present at that time. Like baselining and data and being able to prove what you have actually done is really important. But I also think, certainly from an offsetting market, like think about what those offsets are doing. They are compensating for an impact somewhere else. I totally think landowners that are behaving in positive ways need to be rewarded, but maybe the offsetting market is not the right income stream, because to sort of maintain integrity around offsets, you'd have to put back what's been lost. And if you're not doing that, then arguably you shouldn't be paid for it.
It's a perennial question, and a lot of the debates in crediting are about people who have stewarded land for generations or millennia, including tribes, and there isn't an easy answer there, where they have done this work and never been rewarded for it in the market, but they're nonetheless subject to these risks coming from outside and deforestation and so on in some places. So we don't have an easy answer, but we want to find solutions to that as part of this broader regime, right? We have 2.5 minutes left.
Ryan, do you mind?
Yeah, go ahead, sure.
I deal with a lot of landowners throughout the West, and I always tell them, you know, run your ranch, run your farm the way you need to run it. Do what you need to do, and don't wait on these markets, because these markets are slower than glaciers. So that's number one. Number two, if you're in a regulatory market at all, federal dollars are not useful, right? And you have to unwind it. Doesn't mean it can't be done, but it is a complication, especially in the Endangered Species Act world, as well as Clean Water Act world. In the voluntary markets, they're just not there yet. You know, maybe you can get into a carbon project. You could probably pull that off. I just don't know of any other voluntary markets right now that are real enough that I would tell a rancher, no, don't restore your stream. I mean, if you need to do it for your operation, do it.
Yes, sir.
It makes me uncomfortable to start with a discussion about regulation, because we've had a regulatory program that's pretty heavy-handed for 60 years. We haven't built an incentive program. If the only incentives that we're developing are incentives that operate inside of projects, we're going to limit the footprint of where we're protecting and enhancing biodiversity. And we need to think about how do we create incentives outside of specific project kind of activities to really recover and enhance and protect endangered species. I'd love to know what you're thinking about that. You know, there's a role for regulation. I don't disagree about that. And in lots of functions, you know, the markets need to have a regulation of how they operate. But if all we have is the hammer and no incentive, landowners are going to, you know, continue with the 3 S's.
Remind me of what that is. I laugh every time, but
Shoot, shovel, and shut up.
yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a good point. I've talked with my colleague who works on agricultural issues where there are some incentives, but it's not enough. It doesn't make the difference. So that leaves us with the national and global baseline that we have, which is we have a serious biodiversity crisis, right? Despite all these incentives, they're clearly not doing enough. And as our other question over here said, it's not compensating landowners for the work they're already doing. So we need both. There's no reason we couldn't have carrots, not carrots and sticks, but carrots, and then also regulatory credits that on top of that. Obviously, I think that's a good idea. I think we have last words. We have 25 seconds according to the clock here. Yeah, go
for it. It doesn't have
for
to be
it.
last words, but
Yeah.
we can just keep going. I think there are ways to incentivize broad regional efforts through the Endangered Species Act, and they've tried, right? That's what CCAAs are about, safe harbor agreements and the like. But you're right. I mean, clearly that's been spotty in terms of its success. One idea I've heard recently, and this came from PERC, if you're familiar, which I can't quite punch holes in it, but I'm sure the Fish and Wildlife can. So we've got a few representatives in the room, and I don't mean that as seriously. I'm sure you've thought through this, and there's complications with it. But the idea being, if the species is listed, then give the community, give the region a goal. If you can restore X number of acres of habitat, it doesn't have to be protected necessarily. But if you can do it in a certain amount of time, we'll delist. If you can get the habitat back, we'll delist. And that only works for species that are habitat limited, right? Which is the vast majority of them. So anyway, that's an idea. I'd love to, in the hallway or whatever, if anyone has thoughts on that. That's an incentive. And it would deregulate, all the land uses around if you're successful.
Thank you to our panelists, Jen, Emma, and Adam. Much appreciated.